I want to welcome our panelists. First, we have Chief Brian Keyes joining us from Chelsea, Massachusetts. He is the Chief of Police for the City of Chelsea, which has the highest concentration of immigrants in all of New England. I did the research. In addition to being an attorney at law, he's an active member of the Massachusetts Bar and is the president of the Massachusetts Major Chiefs Association. Welcome, Chief. Joining us from San Francisco, California, Zara Bellew is an attorney and the executive director of the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE, San Francisco Bay Area. As a community organizer and civil rights advocate, she provides trainings at mosques and universities and beyond as part of CARE's efforts to empower the Muslim American community. Welcome, Zara. I want to welcome Caitlin Goki. She is from the Vera Institute of Justice. She is in Minneapolis right now. She is the Senior Program Associate of Policing, and her work focuses primarily on police community engagement, the institutionalization of community policing metrics, and building the capacity of law enforcement to work with limited English proficient populations. Welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Jessica Bernal and Erin Fichter of Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Omaha, Nebraska. Jessica is the Director of Immigration Services, and Erin is a legal representative. And they're both accredited by the Board of Immigration Appeals, providing accessible and affordable legal immigration assistance and services focusing on unifying immigrant families. So as Erin and Jessica come up, I want to get straight into the conversation to talk to Chief Keyes. To eliminate any ambiguity we have on the role of police when it comes to newcomers, how should police present themselves or be seen by new Americans?
I mean, first and foremost, I think it's our job to really welcome all newcomers to this country, to this city when we interact with them. Certainly we should be seen as friendly, trustworthy, respectful. Those are our primary roles. Oftentimes there's individuals that come from certain countries where the relationships with the police weren't the greatest. There might have been abusive situations, there might have been corruption in the police departments. So it's our job really through these interactions, that I could explain them as we go on down the line with the webinar, but it's our job really to let them know what to expect of the police here in this country, and most specifically in our city, in Chelsea, when we deal with newcomers.
All right, I want to turn to Caitlin now and ask her, we just heard the role of police. What is happening in our community? Is that message being conveyed? What is going on with police and the foreign-born in terms of their interactions?
Sure. So in the last decade or so, policing in the U.S. has really experienced some profound changes, both in response to the increased diversification of our population, as well as increased responsibilities of law enforcement post-September 11th. And as a result of the recent demographic changes, in particular the large number of immigrants that are now settling in outside of sort of the traditional gateway cities, many local law enforcement agencies have had to navigate cultural and language challenges that they've never experienced before in order to ensure public safety. So I think, the events of September 11th complicated the nature of law enforcement interactions with immigrant communities, specifically with Muslim and Middle Eastern communities, which were suddenly being identified in large numbers as suspects of terrorist attacks, but were also increasingly becoming victims of hate crimes. So it was sort of this dual, stressor in the community. So right now I think many law enforcement agencies really are recognizing that immigrant groups are a valuable and essential part of ensuring public safety and really protecting homeland security. And they're really trying to implement community strategies and community policing strategies that focus specifically on building trust with immigrant communities. But in a lot of places, resources are strained, training and education is still needed. So there's definitely a gap in, what's understood and what we're able to provide to these communities. And I think, I also want to mention, certainly in the more sort of immediate moment, I think the political rhetoric, specifically the anti-immigrant rhetoric that's become really commonplace during this election season, has not really damaged relations between police and community, but I think we've heard anecdotally from both law enforcement and from immigrant communities that, there's increased concern for hate crimes against immigrants. And we've recently begun a study at Vera that focuses on bias crimes experienced by immigrant communities. So it's an interesting time, definitely, for this work.
And Zara, Caitlin calls it interesting. You might have another word for it. From your vantage point, I think Caitlin pointed to a lot of the issues, language, very fast-changing demographics, especially in new parts of the country for immigrants, the South, the Midwest. From your vantage point, what have you been seeing happening, especially in terms of the factors that inhibit or could possibly help relations between immigrants and law enforcement?
I think a lot of times we look at the rhetoric that we're experiencing this year and think of it as this has gotten really bad all of a sudden. But when I think of what we're hearing now, it for me feels like a symptom of bad policies for a number of years, of a lack of accountability for a number of years, right? So it is true that it's easy to blame a specific cable news network or a specific presidential candidate and say they're contributing to immigrants feeling unwelcome. But there were governors across the country who took positions against Syrian refugees. There are police officers that have defended policies like stop and frisk. There are local elected officials that want to cooperate with ICE. There is FBI surveillance. And so it's not just the rhetoric. It is that we're now more than 15 years into really bad policy that marginalizes immigrant communities and those who might be mistaken for immigrant, which makes it less likely that someone from one of these targeted communities is ever going to call law enforcement for help. And that's a concern that we hear about often from community members is, I don't want to make the matter worse. I don't want a family member to get deported. I don't want to be spied on. I don't want my neighbors to see the police at my house, right? So there's a number of fear factors that come into play, not just because of the rhetoric, but because of bad policies and practices that have unfairly impacted many.
And have you seen this sort of specifically impact Muslim Americans? We know about 2/3 of Muslims in America are actually foreign-born.
Yeah, a huge conversation that we have with respect to immigrant Muslim communities, and not all Muslim communities are immigrant, but for those that are, is many come from countries where relationships with law enforcement aren't so great, where there is large sources of corruption in law enforcement, and they come here hoping for better. And when they find out that an unarmed person was shot and killed and there was no accountability, when they hear that the FBI is surveilling their mosque, when they hear that immigration raids are happening at a local grocery store, that makes these immigrant Muslims less likely to call law enforcement for help. And a top concern for us, given the rhetoric right now, is of course the policies that I've talked about, but also the trickle-down effect of hate crimes. It's really important that immigrant communities and that all people be comfortable calling law enforcement for help, right? We want the people that are tasked with protecting us to be there when we need that protection. But if we are afraid of them also, then we're left alone.
But I think we have Jessica Aaron on the line. Are you there? What have you done to enable or help police fulfill their duties to new American residents in Omaha? What connections, alliances, bridges, allies do you need to make this thing happen?
We've held meetings with the police chief just to let him know the concerns that we have heard from clients, and then also helped relay his message and the things that he feels are necessary from the clients back to our clients, then in order for them to be able to work more effectively with the police and to have that an effective relationship.
How did you go about approaching them? I mean, did you have to build a little coalition to get them on board? What was the reaction like? Get a step-by-step on how you did this.
We worked closely with other service providers here, and when it was about 3 years ago, a new police chief took over, and so we just asked as a collective group of service providers to be able to speak with the police chief and just kind of have a meeting to see exactly where he was, what his thoughts were, what his strategy as far as policing and everything, just kind of so that we could understand where he was coming from and help relay that to our clients. And then just from the things that we've heard and our clients' encounters with the police department for various things, whether they've been calling to make a report or, have had a problem with someone and someone has called the police on them, the concerns that they have brought to us, then we were able to share those. And it was good to have it coming from a collective group instead of just one organization presenting these things. We were able to use the collective effort and have, show that strength in numbers that we were seeing and hearing the same concerns from, various service providers around the area.
And what has the reaction from the police been like, and has it improved since then?
I think the police chief was very open to our suggestions. He seems to have kind of taken into consideration the concerns that we brought and tried to use those things to help in presenting new strategies and new ideas on how to present with the police. And then our clients have also worked, have been working more, I think, along with the police.
And so you talk about this openness of the police, but that there was strength in numbers. You built up a coalition of similar organizations. So it was not just one voice going, it was a collection of voices. And that, in your experience, that showed that it was not an individual concern, but really a community concern. But not every police chief is as open to these things, and I'm sure that Caitlin has had the experience of much more resistant police departments. They're constrained by budgets, by numbers. In the Vera network, maybe you can describe to us what it took for some of the organizations that you work with to get police on board, or even to get just other groups, immigrant groups, community leaders on board.
I mean, it really has varied. I think in many communities, immigrants are really eager to work with law enforcement because they recognize the mutual benefit that they can receive by developing some professional partnership with their local police. In other communities, law enforcement, has to work a lot harder, and they certainly have to be self-motivated. I think if you don't have a chief that believes in the value of these partnerships, there's not a lot you can do. There can be public pressure. Definitely, and media pressure, but this is something that starts at the top for sure and trickles down, and the chief, sets the example for his or her officers as to why this is really important. And in some of those communities where, we've really started from the ground up, I think law enforcement has had to work hard to build trust, and, they've done this through using social media and radio in local languages for sure. Attending local cultural events that happen in their community, visiting churches or mosques or other houses of worship to, put a name to a face, to meet some of the local community members. And I think having a community liaison officer is something that we've really seen as essential. It's one of our sort of core recommendations is creating a community liaison position. We found that agencies that don't have a community liaison we're less likely to have community partnerships with specific immigrant communities. They're less likely to have knowledge and awareness about community customs and norms. And they were, more reliant on some dangerous stereotypes about those communities. So I think a community liaison officer is really the first step to building that trust. It creates a recognized face in the community and appoints a person who's sort of the consistent point of contact for communication about what's going on in the community.
And I want to go to Chief Kais in a moment, but Caitlin, we did a webinar in July about immigrant student success. It was for K through 12 and adult educators. We had Massachusetts Principal of the Year, Dana Brown, who was principal of the most diverse high school in the Commonwealth, and he talked about going out there to where the immigrants were. As you said, the community events, the religious events, the festivals, the mosques, the churches, and meeting them there. And that was a really good first step, even for an educator to do. And we see it happening as well with with law enforcement. But when it comes to the community organizations themselves, so Erin and Jessica from Omaha spoke about building that coalition. What are the other things that community organizations need to do in order to get that unified front to approach police and to maintain that relationship with police and to educate police?
Is this a question for me or for Erin and Jess? For me. I think the sort of visiting the local events, the cultural events, the mosques, all of that, I think that's really important. I think it's also important to look to creating sort of a formalized community advisory council or working group that provides, more formal ongoing communication between law enforcement and community leaders. This helps sort of law enforcement understand what the priorities are of that community, and it also helps create ownership and buy-in among the citizens for what their local police officers are trying to do. So I think community organizations can encourage their agencies to do that, and a lot of this is sort of requires a meeting of the minds. I think community agencies have a lot of resources, a lot of sort of great ideas, and law enforcement does also. And so it's about sort of coming to the table and brainstorming about, what do we need? Do we need sort of more informal opportunities to engage? Do we need something more structured and formalized? And I think, the sort of first step is creating that platform for conversation that's, regular, routine, on an ongoing basis.
One thing I really wanted to ask was getting really the buy-in of the immigrant groups. Not every immigrant group is the same. You have infighting, you have different tribes. How do you get them to solidify and be able to, stand up on their own and be part of this conversation and this relationship?
That's something that has been hard. It seems that the longer the immigrants are here, the more they're willing to start trusting law enforcement and to try and build those connections, but especially someone who has first arrived in the United States and usually has come from a country where law enforcement may be non-existent or is very corrupt. They really are very skeptical about the police and what they can actually do. We just really work to try and educate our clients to let them know, what the role of the police is here, that no matter what their current status is in the United States, that they do have rights and the police are here to protect them.
And until we get the police chief back, Zara, you have embarked on many different innovative initiatives to educate law enforcement, to build one thing is focusing on the law enforcement, but also focusing on the immigrant communities themselves, of building their capacity to do this work. What has your experience been like? What has worked and what has not?
The chief is back.
I think so.
So just really quickly to answer your question, Denzil, before going back to the chief, our focus on the community has really been about empowering them with information. So making sure that they know what their rights and responsibilities are in different interactions with law enforcement. So what should I do so that I am in compliance with the law, cooperating, but also protecting my rights if the FBI wants to come speak to me at my home? What should I do? How should I act in a traffic stop, right? What should I do if I want to record the police? Like, what are my rights and responsibilities in these things? Is that I, as a civil rights attorney, I'm big on teaching people about their rights, but I also want to make sure that I teach them about what they can do to ensure that they're in compliance. And we don't frame it as cooperation or non-cooperation, but rather as safety. Is that it is really important that we are respectful of law enforcement, that we understand that they're public servants, but it's also important that we protect ourselves and our families, and that we use the law to do so, because these protections were put in place by our founders, not these recent immigrant communities, not my organization or your organization. So really helping people feel ownership of their rights is a really important step for me. So it's about the information and then feeling ownership of that information. So it's not enough to just know that I have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney, because if I'm not comfortable and I don't feel like that's something that I really have, I'm not going to assert it. And then on the other side of it, working with law enforcement to ensure that they understand that this community is being taught about their rights, to ensure that law enforcement understands what the various cultural sensitivities are in this community, and that they also know what the concerns are about civil rights issues, right? And so, for example, if there is an issue with surveillance at the mosque by federal law enforcement, that's not the fault of local police, but the impact will include local police, especially if there is a joint terrorism task force that's active in the area or some other local federal collaboration, right? And so it's important that the local police department be understanding of what the impact will be so that they can approach community members with a different kind of empathy.
And now we have the chief back. So I was asking you earlier about your contact with the community and what that experience has been like. And maybe you can sort of guide us step by step as to what happened, how it happened, and how successful it's been.
Sure. Well, first of all, these are all great points. I mean, these are excellent points. Hearing this input from everybody on the panel, I think it's really, really helpful to me as a police chief in a diverse community. So I've been with the department 30 years and the police chief the last 9. And the department, the city itself actually, and the department have changed a lot over the years. We're a very diverse city, but we're also a very diverse police department. And honestly, all the points that were raised by the other panelists are exactly what we're doing here locally. We have a community liaison officer. He was one individual, but honestly, one individual was really not enough. He was getting pulled in a lot of different directions. We hired a civilian newcomer advocate that basically meets and greets all newcomers to the city. We do this with her contact with the Mass General Hospital, with Catholic Charities, and other organizations to find out who's actually coming into the city from different countries, so we can let them know exactly what we're doing here locally with the police department. We just hired, it's been about a year now, a community engagement specialist, which is another civilian position, as well as an assistant, which we'll be hiring probably within the next 2 weeks. Because we're really, honestly, for what we do here locally in terms of enforcement of the law and so forth, it probably takes up about maybe 10, 15% of our activity, our services. Everything else is about reaching out, getting out into the community, basically just fostering trust, building integrity, letting people know we're here for them, letting people know that we're guardians for them. And just really, matter of fact, what we try to do with our officers as well is we have these in-service trainings where we bring individuals in from other countries. It's kind of a cross training, if you will. We let them see us basically in action in terms of our training, what we're training about, what the issues of the day are, and then what we do is we allow people from other countries to tell us about their experiences from where they came from, their experiences with law enforcement, and we try to bridge the divide in that fashion so they can understand exactly what we're doing here locally, and hopefully they can take that to their family, their friends, and one interaction at a time. We just try to build more and more trust each and every day.
I know that you use every interaction you have with the community to build that trust and educate each other. Give us a few examples that, give us some ideas. I know you have a list of things that your police department has done. You've given tours of the police station to refugees from Eritrea. Give us some examples of what you've done that others can replicate.
Sure. Well, it's a great. So yesterday, as an example, there was a group of 30 young students. They're from Central American countries, and it's kind of a small program at Chelsea High School where they're learning English as a second language. And the individual that was running the program asked myself if I could bring a couple officers up just to basically say hello. I know very limited Spanish, but I tried my best. But my other officers speak great Spanish. Out of 111 officers, we have about 40 that speak Spanish. But basically, we just went there just to kind of convey our message that we're here to provide a safe and secure community for them. We're here to, in terms of solving problems, we can't solve problems by ourselves. We need them to sit at the table with us. When I say them, the young kids, people not so young, some of our elderly folks, so we can work together to let them tell us what their agenda is, what their priorities are, so we can work together to try to focus on those issues together. But with the young kids, as far as like yesterday, one of the things I felt, I was kind of 50-50 on whether or not I was going to say this, but I felt compelled to say it. So we have a gang issue here locally, and some of these young kids that come here and are staying with families and relatives and so forth, and sometimes they get tempted to get on the wrong road just by the fact that they come from a given neighborhood in a given country and they get to know someone and they accept this person as a friend. But this person is the so-called friend is on the wrong side of the law. And these kids sometimes they get into this life where they're victims of crimes, or they become suspects in crimes with gang life and so forth. So I try to tell them that, in terms of, whether an individual has any documentation issues at all, that's no concern whatsoever to local police. The only time it'll become a concern is if they do get involved with gangs, they do get involved with drugs, they commit serious crimes. That's when the federal government comes into play, and that's when they really jeopardize their staying in this country. But as far as them, again, if they came in here and there's some issue in terms of how they got here, local police, we have no authority to enforce the federal law. And here locally in Chelsea, it would just really destroy our trust. So we have no notion to go in that direction at all at any time. So I want to explain this to the young kids. This is like, they're in this country, the kids I spoke to, like less than 30 days. It's just that, they're on the straight and narrow, they stay away from that lifestyle. Everything will be great, while they're spending time in the city, the state, and this country.
So starting from very early, they've been here just 30 days, but you're already there starting that relationship, letting them know that it's okay, letting them know that they're safe and that you're there to protect their safety. That's wonderful. And I want everyone to note some of the links that are in the chat box. You're going to find a lot of resources, especially from the Vera Institute, and see the work that the Chelsea Police Department and others have done. And these are going to give you some great ideas as to what you can implement in your own communities, or what you can propose to police departments there that aren't a big cost, that aren't very time-consuming. A lot of it has to do with just education and engagement. And I want to also ask that, so we have some questions coming up. Please type in your questions now, because we want to take at least 5 or 10 minutes of questions for these wonderful experts. It's so great to have all of your hair popping in and out. I want to hear from Erin and Jessica. So, we've heard a lot of great ideas and a lot of wonderful things that potentially can happen. But if you had to choose, 1 or 2 things that would have made your work in this easier, what would it be? More cooperation from the police, from other agencies, more political involvement? Let us know.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Well, here specifically in Omaha, one of the barriers that we have is having bilingual officers. For example, the new immigrants coming into the city primarily speak Spanish, Karen, or Noor, and we don't have enough officers that speak that language. So many times for the clients, it's become very difficult for them to be able to communicate in their native language, or for reports, for example, to be made completely, because many times the officers rely on the person's children to be the interpreters. So not all the stories being provided the entire time. So just being able to have more officers that are bilingual, like it sounds like they have in Boston, which is great, would have really helped us.
Sometimes another thing that we've seen is just kind of that cultural background that I touched on earlier, of making sure that the officers understand the culture and the background where these people are coming from. Many times, we have refugees coming in that have been living through wars, and they are very skeptical about anyone in any kind of a uniform. And then the same way, because of the background that these people have, they're skeptical. The police kind of have, this is the norm in the United States, and that's not necessarily the same thing or what the people experience or are used to in their home country. And so just the kind of the understanding both of where the background of the immigrant on the behalf of the police, but also the background and what the police expect on the part of the immigrant has somewhat been a problem. Just kind of that mutual understanding.
And I know, Caitlin, that you have this portfolio of so many different agencies and police departments, but of course these things don't happen in isolation. You need city and state involvement, you need buy-in, more engaged community leaders, and especially as the demographics change so fast. I mean, what do you want to see at that very local level? What do you want to see more of that would be helpful in building these relationships?
Yeah, I think I said when I started that this is a really interesting time. I'll use that word again. It's an interesting time for this work. I think perhaps more so than ever, both public and political attention is really focused on criminal justice reform, and as law enforcement are the first responders to nearly all social ailments, whether it's criminal or a family conflict or school conflict, they're really the face of the justice system. So they're more frequently or most frequently pointed to when we talk about justice reform. And I think this is something that could work to our benefit. I think, it gives us a little space to test new strategies, to build new partnerships, because this is being really encouraged by everybody who's watching right now. So, and some of our resources that you shared, we do highlight agencies that are doing this really well. I was so happy to see Chief Kais today, because Chelsea is an agency that we point to frequently as an agency that's really working to build police-community relations. And there are other agencies out there that are doing this well, and that I think can serve as models for similarly situated police agencies. And as far as issues, I think we need to start focusing more resources on building the capacity of more suburban or rural law enforcement agencies to serve diverse communities. I think this is a huge issue that we're really overlooking, because we know that, suburbs now are home to more poor people than cities. And there's also 60% of immigrants who live in suburbs now. So the face of suburban America is really changing. And the requirements or the needs from law enforcement as a result has shifted. So we've invested, historically, federal investments have really focused on urban, large cities, to address sort of the police community relation issues that they're facing, but they've neglected to address what's going on in suburbs, which are really becoming sort of a microcosm of what our country is. So I think there needs to be more awareness around that, and sort of more discussion around, or more understanding around what the demographic shifts that are occurring in suburban areas look like, and how those shifts have impacted the role of local police.
Yeah, a lot more education. The changes are happening very fast. You need to know what's going on. You need the data. You need that information, and you need that connection to these communities. And I want to get into a couple of questions that we have here, and perhaps Chief Kais and maybe Zara can jump in here. Angela from Oklahoma City wants to know about what a resettlement agency can do in order to begin that healthy relationship with law enforcement, when that law enforcement has traditionally been resistant to sitting down at the table. I know that Jessica and Aaron spoke about, getting a coalition to come to them. How do you get law enforcement to see the importance of doing this kind of work? Chief Kais?
I could say from my perspective, and I heard it mentioned earlier that, it starts from the top. In today's day and age, I know there's different personalities out there and there's different police chiefs, but for the life of me, I can't understand how any police chief would not understand how critical an issue this is, and then if there was a different group in a given city and they wanted to speak with the chief on an issue, and as you mentioned, that potentially some department could be resistant to these types of conversations. I don't see how any chief could do that. Honestly, there's a lot of change in leadership in police departments across the country. I've seen it here locally in Massachusetts, and I think that through officers rising through the rank, they realize the importance of these issues, and they realize that the days of police officers in a uniform that drive around in a cruiser and just answer calls for service and then wait for the next call. But those days are gone. It's all about engaging with the community. It's all about continuing outreach. I heard it mentioned earlier about some of the suburban. Caitlin mentioned some of the suburban areas of given states, and I couldn't agree more. What we did locally here in Massachusetts, we just had a training mandatory training for police chiefs last week, and it was 300. We have 351 departments. I think we had 260 chiefs that were present, which was actually pretty good. But one of the components that we had was effective community engagement for public safety agencies, and we had, as a matter of fact, I don't know how I got to do this, but I got elected into teaching the course. It was a 2-hour course where we would just reach out to individual chiefs so they knew exactly what was expected of them in terms of community engagement and outreach and how important it was. And in terms of what we use for a model, we use the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. They had 62 recommendations. Of the 62, 16 of them had to do with community outreach and community engagement. So if there's different police chiefs from other parts of the for the state or other parts of the country that live in the suburbs, or police in the suburbs, they have to realize this is important to all of us. This is extremely important to all of us. So at least here locally in Massachusetts, we saw that it's that significant that we laid out the training for police chiefs to have. Sorry about the line.
Zara,
I think the generator just went out in this building.
Oh, dear. That's
no, I
okay.
just came back.
You probably have other ideas for the resettlement agencies and what they need to do to get a resistant police department on board.
I mean, I agree with Chief Kais. It's really sad and unfortunate that that's even a question, but I recognize that that's a possibility, that there are police chiefs out there that aren't even willing to engage at that level. The community organizer side of me says, you go at them with a coalition, which has already been mentioned. You stay civically engaged throughout the cycle, right? So a lot of times what we see in communities of color and other under-resourced places is that we will go to our leaders when we need something, right? But that's not the time to build a relationship. The relationship has to be built before that. So ensure that you know the police chief before you need to ask them for something, and that you stay in touch with them throughout, even if it's just, minimal relationship. It doesn't mean that you have to meet with them every week, but that you're constantly in touch with them. And then, of course, the last piece is political pressure, right? So the police chief is one of a number of leaders in any city, right? So go to the civic leaders, go to the mayor, go to others who could place pressure on the police chief on your behalf in a way that's maybe different from what other community organizations can do. So what I mean to say is go to their peers. That might mean go to a police chief in a neighboring city and say, hey, we have a problem here, or we're not getting the help that we need here, right? And so there's a lot of nice ways to place pressure. And then there's also, I think, more protesty ways to place pressure, and both are important to have in our toolbox.
Those are some excellent points. I don't know if Caitlin and Jessica and Aaron have anything to add before I ask another question. How do you all put that kind of pressure on your local leaders? And I like the idea of talking to another police chief or someone else from a neighboring county. Look at what they're doing and look at the results. Would our community not be better off doing something similar? And there's a very pointed question here, and I guess it has.
Denzel, I'm sorry, if I could just add one line. I think that is awesome advice. I really do. Police chiefs have their own network. They're all friendly with their neighboring police chiefs and so forth. And for whatever reason, if there was someone that was just kind of, turning their face to some groups that wanted to have a conversation locally, to go to a neighbor, I think that's incredible advice. And, just to kind of approach it from that perspective, I think the chief would see things, hopefully see things in a different light. I think that's a great way to get through as well. And
Police Chief Kais, I'm going to keep it with you because we have a very pointed question here on what do you have all different kinds of people in your police force. Not all of them may be on board with doing what you want to do. There's a rising sense of nativism going around the country, many different issues of prejudice. So if you have officers who aren't on board with the leadership position of let's do community policing, let's make every interaction about building trust, how do you approach that?
Well, honestly, if they don't, if officers in this department didn't want to get on board with what the mission and the vision was of the department, then, perhaps it's time to find another job. We have strength in numbers. We have momentum in our department over the last several years, where I think just matter of fact, in our department alone, I just happened to do the count the other day, out of 111, 56 have come on in the last 5 years. So these are all young officers, and I happen to teach in the police academy as well as other officers of the department. So they get the message on what we're doing here locally even before they're actually on the streets. So they come in as brand new officers, and this is the custom, this is the practice, this is the direction that we're going. Thankfully, I appreciate the question, but thankfully I haven't seen the resistance, at least at my level. I have a command staff that's incredibly supportive, as well as the first line supervisors. So I think as was mentioned earlier as well, leading by example, for them to see the police chief in uniform, walking down the street, interacting with people, trying to solve problems, and then the command staff doing the same, and supervisors, they realize this is the direction that we have to take. This is the vision and the mission of the department. Get in line, or honestly, if you're out of line, perhaps find another job. But thankfully, I haven't had to go that route yet. But if it, presents itself, then we'll deal with it.
I think you have quite enough experience to deal with it, should it ever arise. So I want to close off the panel now and move into our last module on messaging. And given that Julie Fisher-Rao of the Opportunity Agenda is going to talk about how to talk about immigrants and immigration, I want to get from each of you just 10 seconds of what advice would you give to community organizations, immigrant leaders, informed citizens, on how to talk about immigrants and immigration. Zara and Chief Guy spoke about putting pressure, political pressure. Jessica spoke about building alliances. In terms of how you talk about this topic, what would your advice be? We can start with Chief Guy.
Well, I think honestly, just advice. It's the right thing to do. I think. I don't know. Maybe I'm kind of biased. I just think that I haven't seen the issues. I haven't seen the obstacles. I just see that, leading by example on both sides of the front, meaning law enforcement and the community-based organizations, getting together, establishing those relationships well before any significant event occurred, talking to each other all the time. I'll tell you the truth. I heard this mentioned earlier. I talk more on the phone via a conversation like this or a text message to community-based people, community-based organizations, advocacy groups than sometimes I do my own offices. They have my number. They're not afraid to call me. The text back and forth. I think that relationship, having that relationship between the, not just the police chief and the department, really all officers will carry a lot of weight going forward.
Caitlin, how do you talk about this topic to the people you need to talk to?
My advice would be to make it relatable. So show how immigrants in your community are contributing, what they contribute, what their sort of added value is as a community member, and what does a local sort of immigrant family look like. It helps take away the stereotypes, and it helps show all people, how these folks are contributing and the value that they have for all of us.
Jessica and Erin, you're in Nebraska, not necessarily at the forefront of immigrant integration. What advice would you give?
Right, just not being as diverse as other places around the, just in the continental U.S. We agree that outreach and education is very key. So just going out in the community and sometimes getting rid of those blanket stereotypes by educating the public more about different communities, especially the newcomers that are coming into the Omaha area, will be key.
And finally, Zara, how do you frame that message when you're trying to put that slightly protesty pressure on the people who need it?
I think for me, it really is about relationship building. When I think of where I might have to resort to go to a city council to complain about a police chief, hypothetically, that would be a worst case scenario, right? The first example I gave was be in relationship with the police chief. And that to me is the same answer for how we dispel and change stereotypes about immigrant communities, immigrant families, and so on, is in addition to going out and telling welcoming communities, these people aren't any different than you. They're worried about the same things. Let's also get them to sit down for dinner together. Let's get their kids to volunteer for a project together so that they see each other as neighbors rather than as welcomers and immigrants.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This was a fabulous discussion. I think we learned quite a lot on what we can do on either side of the spectrum in order to, build that bridge and ensure that we have safer, more secure and communities in solidarity at the end of the day. So thank you very much, everyone. Chief Kais, Caitlin Goki, Jessica and Erin, and Zara Bellew. We hope to see you again next time.